City Council Finance Committee meeting. So we have to follow the formalities even though we are still remote. So I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. This is a joint meeting of the Rochester City Council Finance Committee and also our folks over at the Rochester City School District. Just let me give a little background as to why we're all here on a screen and not meeting face to face. I wish we could meet face to face, but as you know, today is Friday, April 24th. We're in a Zoom meeting in accordance with the executive order during the COVID-19 crisis, and this meeting is being streamed live online, as well as the cities and city council social media, Facebook and YouTube pages and all that good stuff. So with that, I'm going to ask our clerk, Hazel Washington, to call the roll of all of the City Council Finance Committee members, and then we'll start the meeting. Madam Clerk.
Councilmember Evans.
Present.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Councilmember Evans.
Present.
Councilmember Harris. Councilmember Patterson. Vice President Lightfoot.
Vice President Lightfoot is present, ma'am.
President Scott.
Here.
Thank you.
And we are joined by all of our, we are also joined by our other city council member colleagues. So we're here because, as you know, the city of Rochester is also getting ready to start its budget process. But in the course of our regular meetings that we have our chair meetings once a month. We thought that it would be very advantageous for us as two entities to start talking about the budget process early on. Because as you know, the district budget hearing is scheduled for June 10th, and we don't want to wait to June 10th to start talking about all of the pertinent budget issues that might come up along. So my hope is that this is the first of many meetings that we can have related to budget and other district financial issues, because our entities are very much related. So this was an opportunity for us to be able to hear from the superintendent and the board on where they're at in their budget process. We know that your budget is not done until the finally done until the first week of May, but we wanted to at least start hearing what's going on now, so that way we can start anticipating questions that may come up and be able to do it in a way where it's constructive. BJ Scanlon from our staff has been working with district folks to create and city council members to create a question log. So I've asked that we start logging questions that cannot be answered now to be added to that log, so that way there can be conversations on questions going back and forth throughout the budget process. So that way when we get to the budget process, we'll have answers to questions that might be coming up in the interim. The other thing is, I know that there was the final comptroller's audit was issued, I believe, 2 days ago. I'm still reading that myself, but it is my hope that we can also have maybe a follow-up session on how the board and the district are working on addressing those issues that were raised in the audit and bring those back. You know, we had our last session last fall when we talked about that. So I think that it'd be constructive for us to have another session on that topic as well. What I'd like to do is have, my understanding is Linda Quick and Bob Franklin will be giving this presentation. I'd like for them to be able to give their full presentation before we go into questions, and then open it up to my colleagues on the Finance Committee and other council members that are present for questions that are related to the budget. Obviously, any questions that we can't answer, I ask that they be captured by staff, and then that there would be the appropriate follow-up There are some questions that were sent in advance that I'm sure that the district may have seen. I know you guys have been busy over there, so you may not have had time to answer those questions yet, but at least it gives you an idea of some of the things that we're looking for in terms of the few questions that have been submitted. So with that, I'll turn it over to Linda and Bob for their presentation. I see President White has joined us. Thank you, President White, and all of the colleagues, Chairwoman Beatrice LeBron, who chairs the Finance Committee. Thank you both again for your time and being here. So with that, Linda and Bob.
Thank you very much. I will lead off, and I believe that our presentation will come on the screen in a second. There it goes, like magic. I want to preface this by saying that this is a draft. This is a compilation of a couple of different efforts that we have had to go back a couple of times to the table and make some adjustments to our budget. So I would preface, however, that deliberations continue with our goal of having an adopted budget by May 7th. I also want to thank everybody for joining the call. Council members, thank you for giving us this opportunity. And to our commissioners who are online, thank you for also participating. And please jump in at any point if you would like to add additional information or comments. But we can proceed through, that would be great. We'll go to the next page. And Bob, I'm going to have you start here with this slide.
Thank you. Council members, I'm sure you know our recent history here. So just very briefly, current fiscal year, realizing the financial predicament the district found itself in, proposed mid-year reductions that occurred during the months of December and January to close the current year budget gap by $30 million. I believe you all know there's a comptroller's report about the current year deficit. Their numbers and our projections of the deficit were really close. And we had a lot of conversations to whittle that difference down to a nominal amount. But we did process reductions worth $30 million. I believe you all know New York State, thankfully, came through with a $35 million spin-up loan to the district. This will allow us to close the current fiscal year on an even basis and recoup the unrestricted fund deficit that you may have seen on our CAFR issued last June. And then basically just projecting our current operations into the upcoming budget year, we had better than a $60 million deficit to account for. So we had to get to work on that right away. I will highlight for you when we initially submitted the original draft budget to our board, we included a little additional state aid. You may know that the governor's budget proposed a slight increase for RCSD in our foundation aid. When we look back over the past several years, 6, 7, 8 years, we find that historically the state legislature has added back or granted us an additional $7 to $8 million over the governor's proposal. So as we worked internally to close that better than $60 million budget gap, we felt we could recognize the legislature's past practice. And in doing so, we assumed that the legislature would increase our foundation aid by an additional $4.5 million. And I would like to strongly point out that this assumption was made well before the coronavirus outbreak and before knowing what the national impact of this crisis would have on New York State's budgets. If we could advance to slide 4. I mentioned our projections. So basically, the budget office goes through what we know. In the governor's proposed budget, we received our initial state aid runs, combined with additional local and federal revenues. We're projecting forward better than $793.5 million in revenues for the general fund. In projecting our expenses on the next slide, again, this is all back in January 2020. Just projecting forward, our great areas of expenditure, compensation and benefits is the lion's share of our budget. But we're also projecting out our charter school tuition, charter school enrollment, the special education tuition, the whole host. And it was relatively methodical on how the budget office went through these projections, but it led to $855 million in expense, which is significantly higher than our revenues, showing a $61 million deficit. We had to account for that, and for that, I would turn this back over to Linda.
So we started with a $61.8 million deficit when we first began the budget development process. And that in and of itself was a pretty daunting task, but I want to assure everybody that we really did approach this from a very methodical and strategic approach. So we first looked at our board priorities that they provided to us, but we made many original reductions and adjustments to our budget, not only to reflect those priorities, but in the effort to create not only a fiscally sound budget, but also an educationally sound budget that let us continue to do the important work that we need to do to improve student achievement in this district. We really had to make strategic decisions in crafting this budget. So we made reductions in our senior leadership team, which we'll cover in a few minutes. We made a central office reorganization, as well as a reduction in our central office staff in order to accommodate this $61.8 million deficit. I want to stress that at the very beginning of our process, we engaged in the right sizing process for our schools. We do have a declining enrollment in our district. We've had a declining enrollment for many years. We have not adjusted our staffing and building configurations as rapidly as our student enrollment has dropped. So we knew this was not only an opportunity, but a necessity for us to do so. So we went through a very methodical process. We took a look at our class ratios in each of our buildings, and we have adjusted them accordingly, adjusted our staffing according to the ratios that we were allowed to have by our collective bargaining agreements. So if we were permitted to have 25 students in a class at a certain grade level, we adjusted our staffing to reflect that. We adjusted administrative staff to reflect that. So it was based upon a formula, and we believe that formula started with a very fair and equitable process for all of our schools, and that was our baseline. We also, as part of this process, had to look at program school transitions, and we're going to cover some of the details of that in just a minute. This is an overall chart. Again, this is the initial efforts at our budget, the initial proposal that we created. And this is a summary by our bargaining unit of where the reductions originally came when we proposed our budget in March. And you will see that overall, we made a 3.9% reduction in staff. And you can see by bargaining unit where the various reductions are. ASAR is our administrative unit. They had a 9.3% reduction, et cetera. I don't have to read certainly the screen to you. Again, this was from our original draft. And I want to stress that it's 482 FTEs that we originally projected needed to be reduced in order to bring in a balanced budget with the $61.8 million deficit. In the earlier slide, we spoke to the fact that we reorganize our central office staff. This is actually the reorganization of our cabinet level staff. And this is really to accommodate our needs to address the educational issues in the district, but also to achieve efficiencies. And so overall in central office, we made $2.9 million in reductions in our first budget draft. We reduced 4 of our SEG, or Superintendent's Employment Group staff. Many of would be reflected on this page. That would bring us to 5 reductions since the start of the 1920 school year. Also, as part of this, in the previous slide, we mentioned we had to make some school and program transitions. I said that we started our process with formulaic staffing approaches for all of our schools, all of our programs, and all of our staffing. That included administration, teachers, clerical, paraprofessionals, et cetera, in all of our units. But when we did that, we still had to reach additional efficiencies, and we realized that we had some areas where we actually could close programs and transition schools. So the first thing that we have identified as a closure is the Bilingual Language and Literacy Academy, also known as BLLA, to the tune of $2.7 million in savings. We also, as part of our first budget draft, have chosen to close Young Mothers and Interim Health Academy and transition those students into other schools and programs. This is estimated to save a total of $2.2 million. We did so, however, in both of these programs thoughtfully of how we would program for these students. So our bilingual learners will transition back into their home schools, and we will provide them with the staffing and supports necessary to be successful in those schools. With regard to Young Mothers and Interim Health Academy, we have spoken with the All City staff, and we have a process in place with All City and a plan with All City where we will transition those students who elect to go to All City into that program, and they will have all of their needs met there. If students want to go to their home school, they will have that election as well, and we will provide whatever sports they would need if they elect to go to their home school instead of All City. But there will be an option there, and we will provide all of the necessary supports and resources for them to be successful in either of those environments. Thank you. I also want to talk briefly, we've had numerous conversations about our Rochester International Academy, also known as RIA, and we have elected to propose some changes to RIA, and that involves, RIA is currently a K-12 program, and we are looking at moving the K-5 portion of the program out and keeping it as a 6-12 grade school rather than a program. There are multiple reasons for this. First and foremost, State Ed has been issuing advice and guidance to us, and in fact, we have a corrective action plan that requires us to make changes at RIA. In particular, the recommendations and requirements from the CAP clearly identify that we have failures to appropriately enroll, identify, and place ELS and SIFE students. And on February 19th, we received a letter from State Ed that actually was in response to our CAP and actually instructed us to make some additional changes because of our failure to appropriately transition students from the newcomer program at RIA to their home schools. So part of our proposal to transition the K-5 population out of RIA is to meet the requirements of our CAP and the additional guidance that we received on February 19th. I want to assure you that in transitioning our K-5 population out of RIA, we will provide programming for them at their home schools at the appropriate grade level with the appropriate staff for them to be successful. Thank you. We are planning to move New Beginnings, Youth and Justice to the 4th Street of Hart Street as part of our budget process. We will share staff with our Links program in Hart Street. This will achieve greater efficiencies, and we are projecting that it will also reduce $800,000 in our budget. This will allow us to eliminate the lease at Oxford Street, which is a $20,000 savings, and this $820,000 savings will be part of the budget that we present on May 7th for the board to approve. So a huge initiative in the district has been our restorative practices and social emotional supports that we provide to our students. I want to assure you that we are remaining focused on both of these aspects of our programming and supports. So I want to just point out some of the things that we currently have in place to support social emotional needs of our students. We have building-based counselors, and as part of this budget process, we aligned our counselors to recommended staffing levels that was equitable and fair across all of our buildings. There is a reduction in counselors as part of this process, but I want to also point out that we have 6 central school counselors that support our K-6 buildings. They will remain in place. We also have a $2.9 million contract for the Center for Youth that support our schools with alternatives to suspension, help zone, and to support our restorative practice initiative. We have 11 centrally located FTEs, which include the ROC's restorative team, that support our schools with restorative practices and our social and emotional learning as well. I also want to point out that the Monroe County Department of Social Services has offered additional support, additional social workers through our Catholic Family Services, again, to support our need to provide social and emotional supports for our students. So in generating our staffing ratios that I alluded to earlier across all buildings, we have followed some guidelines provided by various agencies, and in particular, the American School Counselors Association has a recommended counselor to student ratio of 1 to 250. We use that in doing our initial staffing projections for our buildings. For social workers, we follow the New York State Social Worker Survival Kit in making recommendations for our budget adjustments and staffing adjustments. For school social workers, that is a 1 to 50 ratio, and that's what you will see that our staffing model follows. We've allocated a 1 to 50, I'm sorry, just for a second. The 1 to 50 ratio is actually for students with intensive needs. I will tell you that our final budget allocations actually keep us well below that ratio. So we will be able to meet all of the IEP needs of our students. Those are those intensive needs that are referenced, and we will have additional social worker time available to support needs throughout the building in students that do not have IEPs, who do not have pre-identified needs. Also with the counseling staff, every K-8 building is allocated a 1.0 FTE of a counselor, and our secondary schools, again, follow that 1 to 250 ratio. The reductions in social workers and counseling staff account for a $2.6 million savings in our original budget. I want to talk a little bit about special education. We've had a lot of questions about special education. I want to start by assuring you that all of the needs identified and required to be provided by a student's IEP will be met as part of this budget process. The budget that we have presented accounts for all of those services and all of the requirements laid out in those IEPs. But I do just want to point out briefly that in 5 years, our special education population has increased by 1.9%. You can see the numbers here from the 2014-15 school year through the 2019-20 school year. We have actually increased our enrollment in both our total special education student population as well as our pre-K population. We started with 5,248, and this particular school year we have 5,350. Going to the next slide. So while our population has increased by 1.9%, we actually have increased our special education budget over the same time period at $37.8 million. That amounts to a 27% increase in that same 5-year period. We also, during the same 5-year period, have increased our staffing by 374 FTEs. Again, that accounts for a 31% increase in our special education staff in 5 years. I would go back and just remind that the population increased by 1.9%, but we actually had an increase in 31% in staffing. So needless to say, we do have some reductions in our area of special education. We go on to the next slide. I want to stress, however, that our reductions clearly will allow us to continue all mandated services, all IEP services. I can't assure that enough to our council members that that is part of this budget development process. Bob, do you want me to continue or do you want to?
I can give you a breath.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, can we go back to slide 17, please? Thank you. You may or may not know, we have 2 of our union contracts that will soon be expiring, but are in firm place right now. Our 2 larger contracts, or maybe I'll call it our 2 more expensive contracts, given the staff they represent, our teacher and our supervisory administrative staff, are currently under negotiation. Right now, they remain at impasse and they have been at impasse due to our ongoing budget concerns. But both sides are ready and willing to come back to the negotiating table once we can get this upcoming budget settled and behind us. We have been working with New York State Education to identify expenses that we can shift out of our general fund over to title funding. That was important to us to provide budgetary relief for the general fund. But just to assure you, it was not haphazard shifts. We did work very closely with our state ed representatives to make sure that we had their concurrence before we actually put this into our budget. We took a pretty thoughtful and deep dive into our contracts for professional and technical services to really address which of our contracts could also be shifted over to title funding, or in fact just outright reduced or eliminated. I believe we reduced all of our contracts in excess of $7 million off what was originally about a $36 million budget. We looked at further reductions within our general fund and squeezed another $5 million from the original current year budget that we had projected forward. Looking at the next slide.
If I could just jump in here. The previous reduction in staff that we identified, if we had not swept the grant funds and moved people into grant funds, the reductions would have been significantly more. So we literally have maximized every possible grant dollar to keep staff and programs in place. In doing so, as Bob said, we had to have the approval of the state education department, so we've been in constant communication with them over the last 3 months and giving us the permission to swipe those grant monies and put them for dollars for staff. So that has been a pretty involved process, but with the agreement of state ed, they have given us that authorization to do so.
Thank you. So as we did look to close that early projection of a $61 million and change budgetary gap, we looked all throughout our general fund budget. This district has been discussing building closures for the past several years. It's clear that we had to reduce the district's footprint and right size based on our declining enrollment. And we did work with some outside consultants to identify and rank by objective, as objective as we could get, criteria of all our buildings. So the initial budget that was submitted to our board did include closing 2 of our schools, 44 and 57. And because we had also been working with state ed on some other programmatic changes, such as with our International Academy, we identified the opportunity to realign our services and shift students to other buildings. So total building level staff reductions of almost $14 million. I'm going to jump down to the highlighted row. I'm going to reiterate, we did assume in the original draft budget that the state legislature would find an additional $4.5 million for us. We updated our building aid and our debt service projections. We did reduce our central office costs. We originally had built into the initial budget a $5 million appropriation to help rebuild our fund balance that had to come out in our first grasp of $61 million. I did give the city budget director a heads up that we were going to seek permission to reduce our cash capital contribution from the city charter requirement of 10 million down to 5 million. And then the rest of this is the rest of this presentation is more about our reductions to our workforce. So that's how we really came up with the $61.8 million in reductions, only to find ourselves that just was not enough. By the time the state budget came around, we found out that our aid from the state was going to be flat from the current year. That took about $17.5 million out of our pocket. We are grateful that New York State approved a $35 million spin-up aid. We do have to pay that back. We're going to pay that back over the course of 30 years. So at the end of the year, the state will actually withhold from our aid payment just a little over $1.1 million. We do have a board policy on fund balance. When our general fund balance falls below 5% of operating expenses, policy has us recover that fund balance to the tune of 1% each year until we're up to the full 5%. Now on our budget, that 1% calculates out to about $8 million. That was important to us. We did consider recommending to the board that perhaps they should suspend or amend their policy and only do a 0.5%. And we did run that by the comptroller's office, who strongly recommended that we don't follow through with that recommendation. So we are right back to the $8 million we were going to suggest. So all that means we have to find another $26.6 million.
Well, I will jump back in here and take over. So we started with 61.8. We just added $26.6 million more in deficit for a total of over $87 million. So what was a daunting task became even more daunting just a few weeks ago. But we, again, in an effort to try and remain educationally sound and fiscally sound, had to go back to the drawing boards, and we put forward a recommendation that included the following. And the first thing I'll talk about is school closure for school number 20. That's a school in the Northeast Zone. It is in CSI status at this point. Building capacity at 20 is 410 students. The projected enrollment for 2021 was 308 students. That building is currently a pre-K to 6 building, but we believe there's sufficient capacity in the Northeast Zone to accommodate the students from school 20. We have ran those projections. The building is currently old. It's not scheduled to be renovated in future FME planning, and the building simply would not be reused. So it is a closure completely of school 20. In doing so, we are estimated a savings of $3.5 million. Next building I want to talk about is 43. School 43 is in the Northwest Zone, also in CSI status. Building capacity is 594 students. The projected enrollment at 43 for 2021 is 387 students. Again, it is also a pre-K to 6 building, but we also, again with 43, believe there's sufficient capacity in the Northwest Zone to accommodate all the students from school 43. Looking at 43, we are looking at 43 as potential swing space. It has sufficient parking, it's a good location, so 43 would not shutter, but 43 would be available to us for swing space. The general fund savings for closing 43, I believe, is $4.3 million. Thank you. And the last building I want to talk about is school number 3. So school number 3, we looked at as a possibility of bringing back a middle school to school 3. Moving the K-6 enrollment to other South Zone elementary schools. This would allow us to further support a shift of our K-8 buildings across the entire district to a K-6 model. We really are moving towards that. It can't happen immediately, but it's a gradual process that we're going to. So again, this would allow us to support that process. So we would move our 7th and 8th grade students to Jefferson next year, and they would remain there through the FMP process. I believe they would actually return in 21-22. But upon FMP completion, our 7th and 8th grade students would return to school number 3, and they would return to it as the Nathaniel Rochester Middle School. We're pretty excited about this move and think it would be a great move in creating a middle school in that building. The general fund cost savings in so doing by eliminating the K-6 from school number 3 is $1.7 million. So the next page is the totality of staff reductions from the original proposal with the additional staff reductions that we just covered to reach the $26.6 million gap. So you'll see our total at the bottom across all of our units is 341.44 FTEs, or reduction of 5.7%.
So thank you, Linda. And I just will reiterate that even with the additional staff reductions you saw on the previous slide, we are still within our obligations within the collective bargaining agreements. So all these additional efforts we've identified with those 3 buildings, 3 additional schools, $9.5 million in savings. We had initially considered $6 million from the East EPO reductions, which are currently being discussed, and we have actually another Zoom call in just a little while. and you're going to be interested in about this, we are going to be reaching out again to City Council for a complete waiver this year for a cash capital contribution. By city charter, it's $10 million. We are going to be asking the City of Rochester to completely waive that this year. You did that for the current year as well. We have identified about $600,000 in additional reductions within our central office. These are both staff and pay freeze related. And with the enacted state budget, there was a change in the Article 7 bill. The Article 7 bill changed statutory language that assists RCSD as our funding is being held flat. What we have to pay the charter schools was adjusted proportionally. So you will find a 94.5% adjustment to our charter school tuition rates. When we rerun those numbers, it's about a $5.5 million savings. So that is actually how we came up with the remaining $26.6 million once the state budget was enacted. Still more work to do, but in the span of over about 8 months for the current fiscal year, this district found $30 million in its mid-year reductions. We were blessed that the state of New York provided $35 million in additional spin-up aid to close out the current fiscal year. But looking ahead into July 1st of this year, we had to trim a total of $87 million from our initial projections. 60 million from the first go around that we submitted our budget to the board, and then subsequently additional 27 million once our state aid was adjusted in the enacted budget. Not an easy lift, but the entire management team here at RCSD really stood together and dug pretty deep.
So that is our presentation.
Thank you.
Can I offer questions?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm going to open it up to questions in 1 second. I'll start off. I just have 2 or 3 points. I mean, my first point I'll make is I think that as elected officials, this is really the work. If we don't have balanced budgets, we can't do anything else. So this is the budgeting part is always, I think, one of the not I think it is. I think the most important thing that we do. In terms of the first question on grants, I know that you said that you were able to get some, Linda, able to get the state's permission to sweep some of the grant money to use for other things. Are you concerned about any disallowances? The district before ran into trouble, and some of the board members may remember this with the education EPI grant, that they got a disallowance basically and ended up having to pay that back. So has the state given that in writing that they're going to allow that? So if leadership or something changes at the state, they then will not come back and say this grant money was used for other purposes than what was intended in the grant?
Yes, that's a great question. We had started a communication with them in January to start to sweep those grants. And actually, many of them have already been swept and the transfers have already been made because the grant periods either end June 30th or August 31st. So we've already made many of those changes, but there's been a steady stream of communications, and it's not verbal, it's all in writing. So it's a great question. We absolutely have gotten it back in writing from them.
Okay, good. And then my second question is just clarification.
I'm so sorry. If I could just add one thing to that. So sorry. We actually followed some of the direction of the state ed department even as far back as last August. So when the former commissioner came in with her team and she had reviewed our title usage, most especially all of our title grant usage, and said that we had not been using them appropriately. We actually were sending she was very correct in that. we were sending a lot of money back every year that wasn't even being used. And what we were using it for, some of it was really borderline. We shouldn't have been. So as Linda said, we redid everything in January, but we followed their recommendations. So they actually encouraged us to do this even before we, moved in this direction. Thank you.
And then my second question, and then I think I saw Councilmember Patterson had a question before I get to him. The cash capital, because this relates to obviously legislation that the administration would submit on your behalf to council. We did this last year and we did it kind of as a one-time thing. Obviously with what's happening at the state, we know that the conditions on the ground have changed with COVID and everything else. Is it $5 million that would net you, or $10 million that would net you in your request that will come before council in terms of waiving the cash capital requirements? Is it 5 or 10?
Thank you for clarifying that question. When you receive the request from the city school district, it will be a request for a full $10 million waiver.
Okay. And just with that, with that request, when such a request like that comes, it would be good to know how whether or not that would severely still impact the condition of those buildings, and if not, what's being done to ensure that it's not jeopardizing health or safety. I know obviously you would not let that happen, but that's a big concern of mine, because even though I think that is necessary, the city technically owns the buildings, and even though you are the stewards of them, we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So I think with that request, if that can be outlined or put in there, I think that will be great. And then my last question before I get to Councilmember Patterson is, has there been any success on your front in terms of talking with the state about trying to time your state aid payments differently to align to be able to help you be able to manage cash flow better?
Well, yes, sir. Actually, we have, but they are not unique conversations to the city school district. They're actually general conversations applicable to any district. With that $35 million in spin-up aid, that was very important to us from a cash flow basis. We also have I believe now an 8-year track record of the state allowing, I believe it's section 3906-A of education law, where a state aid payment that would have come to us in the month of June has been advanced to the current state fiscal year, the month of March. We actually expected about $38 million to be advanced this year. And I was very pleasantly surprised that in actuality, the state advanced us just over $41 million. So the state has been very helpful in working with the district in that regard.
Great, thank you. And you guys may have seen, and I'm sure if you have not had time to get answers to these questions, we can get them in writing. Some of my colleagues submitted a few questions already in writing. I'm not sure if you saw those, Linda. And if after Councilmember Patterson asks his questions, if you have answers to any of those questions, feel free to touch on them, or they can be for time's sake, but also just for efficiency's sake, because there's just so many people on the call. Those answers can be written in writing. Some of them do relate to the comptroller's report that came out, and those answers can go there. But Councilmember Patterson, your question?
Sure, I've got a couple of questions. I'd like all of the answers in writing. Don't worry about trying to answer them now. I don't want to hold everybody in all day. Okay, so on page 5 of your presentation, cash capital outlays, you go from roughly $3 million for the 1920 amended budget to roughly $13 million for the 2021 projected budget. To give us an explanation of what's going on there. That same column coming down to your contingency, you had roughly $400,000 there. You're going to, it looks like, 0 for your 2021. So if you could address those. address that in writing, that would be great. As we go forward in your presentation and we go to the section where you were dealing with school closures. Originally, you were looking at closing schools 44 and 57 for roughly a $5.3 million savings. I understand you're probably looking to repurpose those buildings, so you're not looking to, so you may or may not be looking to close. Well, you're obviously not looking to close them. I guess my question is there some additional cost related to the repurposing of those buildings that is going to be reflected in this budget cycle? If it is, could you please tell us what those full costs are? Again, this is your budget. Y'all, to the commissioners, y'all decide what happens here. But it would be nice to know if you aren't closing those buildings, but you were originally looking to close those buildings, and you are now looking to reuse those buildings, what additional costs are you going to incur in reusing those buildings? That would be nice to know. If we go now to page 20, not page 20, but page 20 of your page 20 of your presentation regarding the closure of school number 20. Are you actually looking to return that building to the city of Rochester? So that would be a nice thing to know for sure. You were very clear that you were looking to keep 43 as swing space. A quick comment. I didn't know that number 3 wasn't a middle school on page 22. 30 years ago, it was interim middle school, and that's when I went there, and, you know, hey, sounds great. I now go over to the auditor's report regarding your budgeting, multi-year financial planning. One of the key concerns raised on page 5 was that district officials have a practice of budgeting negative figures within their budget, in essence, unappropriating funds, which causes the budget to be balanced on paper. And then it says later on in that document, this practice of budgeting negative figures is unnecessarily confusing, as researchers hired by the district to study its budget development process stated, within the decades of our experience in school finance, we have never seen original allocations with negative numbers. So the question is, have you stopped that practice? Is that something that the board still supports, or is that something that the board will mandate, require, no longer continue in your budgeting process? And those are my questions for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Those have been captured, Mr. Scanlon? Yes, sir.
Yes,
and
they have.
Okay, thank you. And Bob or Linda, if there's anything, obviously you don't have to give detailed answers to any of those now, but if overall, if you wanted to address any of those things that the council member mentioned, please feel free before I go on to anyone else for questions.
Wait a minute.
Certainly
I'm sorry,
provide answers. We may want to talk. Oh, I'm sorry.
There was one last one.
Go ahead, Linda.
It wasn't.
Mike.
Just one last one, and I do apologize. Also,
right,
in the auditor's report, it had mentioned roughly six areas that you, as an organization, did not appropriately project expenditures. And so my question is, for those 6 areas, are you looking at the long-term trends in those expenditures, or adjusting them in some manner, some way, that you're going to be a lot closer to the number? And that, now I'm done.
Okay, thank you, council member. Ms. Quick, thank you.
We will definitely provide written answers, Councilmember Patterson, to all of those questions. Mr. Franklin, you may want to just talk briefly about the last 2 questions in the auditor's report, just the approach of the finance team here now, and that it is a different approach to the budgeting process.
Certainly happy to do that. And one of the written questions, question 3, is from the comptroller's audit regarding our inaccurate estimates of appropriations, which is also related to Councilmember Patterson's question. If I may be frank, it wasn't necessarily so much that we don't know how to estimate revenues or expenses. I would suggest to you that the real result of those poor estimates was the fact that significant dollars had to be cut from our budget, and they didn't know how to do it, and time had run out, so they indiscriminately reduced a number of items and thought they could figure it out later. And of course, later never happened. In our approach to the upcoming budget, the budget director and I, and the entire budgetary staff, and I will suggest to you, the auditors did not fault any of the staff, the line staff in our district. They really faulted management. So the budget director and I, and the entire budget staff, have a little more integrity, and we promised this team that the board would have a balanced and honest budget presented to them. We will not indiscriminately shortchange any of our appropriations in this budget. With respect to the negative appropriations, I definitely understand the perspective of the state comptroller. It's just kind of how the budget works in the district historically. Our largest negative appropriation is for staff vacancies and staff turnover. My experience in other municipalities is we simply apply a vacancy factor to the gross appropriation for salaries. Here at RCSD, it's just the opposite approach. We leave the full gross appropriation for salaries as is, but then we have an offsetting negative appropriation for a calculated benefit or a calculated savings due to vacancies and turnover. The budget director and I took a very thoughtful approach for valuing the amount of dollars for that negative appropriation. I suggest to you it was, again, thoughtful and methodical. And as I said to the state comptroller, by the way, you may know, the state comptroller's office will be reviewing the district's upcoming year's budget. And we are providing the state comptroller's staff the supporting documentation we produce in order to generate those revenue and expenditure estimates. So we are in that process right now, and the comptroller will be issuing a report after their review of our budget. And as I said to the principal examiner here, I do expect upon their review, they will find that we took a more methodical and thoughtful approach to our budget. I hope you will find the same. So we do have the state comptrollers as an independent verification of our estimates. And I will add on to that. We should very soon have an independent academic and fiscal monitor assigned to the district who will be working and supervising our finance department in the preparation of a longer range, a 5-year financial plan. In our budget book, historically, we presented a look only 2 or perhaps 3 years into the future and shows a structural gap. We'll be working with our independent monitor to produce a 5-year projection for the district.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I hear that, but I guess this is a question into the commissioners. If you have a process that no other school district follows for their budgeting, and it is seen as challenging, I guess is a way of putting it, by the state auditors looking at it, why would you want to continue with that process?
Let me go to President White, Commissioner. Let me go to the board president to touch on that briefly. He may want to get back to you in writing, but Commissioner, President White. You got to unmute.
Thanks.
Yep.
Councilman Patterson, I appreciate the question. We wouldn't want to continue in a practice that's not effective. And the comptroller's report indicated some of the practices in our district are not effective. But right now, we're in the process of reviewing that. We're obviously focused right now on the here and now, which is producing an on-time budget and balanced budget to you all. We are working regularly. Our staff is working regularly with the comptroller's office. So the short answer, perhaps not sufficient answer to you right now, is we're looking at all those practices and we're reviewing quite seriously the comptroller's report. As you all know, we also have an extensive 84-page action plan that was in response to the Distinguished Educators Report. There's a significant portion of that plan that relates to financial practices. But Mr. Patterson, if you'll give me a brief opportunity, I will answer that question or have staff answer that question in a more detailed fashion. And if I can't give you what immediate action steps, I will tell you when they will be taken.
Fair enough. Thank you, sir. I do appreciate your response.
Sure.
No, thank you very much. Any other council members have questions?
I have a question.
Councilmember Lupien? Lupien, who was the other one?
Jackie.
Commissioner, okay, let's go.
Also Mitch.
Lupien, and then Lupien Ortiz. Go ahead. Councilmember Lupien.
Sure. I actually have 3 questions. My first one is in the cost savings for closing the bilingual academy, the young mothers, and RIA, the K-5. Is the cost of providing those services in other schools reflected in the savings, or is that somewhere else, reflected somewhere else? My second question.
Councilmember?
Yes.
We have already reflected the cost of transitioning those students into other buildings in the cost of we've already received in the budget.
Okay, so the ongoing supports is reflected in that.
Right.
Okay. 2, I think there's a number of positions that are being cut at central office having to do with cultural competency and African American studies, and wondering if those are still a priority and being handled in another position. If you could speak to that.
Could I answer that quickly, just to put it out there publicly? So yes, we have made a reduction in the Director of African American Studies. However, we have replaced that position with the Director of Culturally Linguistic Responsive Initiatives, which is more than just African American Studies. It would be other racially diverse groups as well.
Councilperson Lupien, if I could respond as well. As you all know, this is an ongoing process. These are the superintendent's recommendations. The board is deliberating over each and every recommendation. So as I'm sure you're aware, the budget may ultimately, when it gets to you all, look a little bit different. I know that there are board members that have interest in those particular positions that you just referenced. So there is still some dialogue on this, and I know everybody knows this, but that, of course, is not the final budget. We have much to talk about in the ensuing 2 or 3 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just let me throw in, Councilmember Lupien, before you continue on your questions. We'll have more of these sessions with city council members, but today a lot of the main focus on was to be on not so much the programming, which I'm sure we'll have questions about, but the dollars and cents, because we have to make sure that we get a balanced budget, period. Now, I'm interested in all the programming stuff, bilingual, all that stuff. I'm interested in it. But our fiduciary responsibility as council members is that they got to submit a balanced budget. So I would urge my colleagues to really, let's look at the numbers, how they're arriving at their numbers, their estimates, their budgets. It's boring stuff, but right now, and I'm sure our budget director would agree with me, we need confidence around the numbers, and that's where a lot of the focus has to be right now. And I think that we can move on to programming and what they're cutting and all that good stuff next month when we have another one of these sessions. But go ahead,
Sure.
Councilmember Lupien.
My final question is around School 25. Wondering if the recent developments there will be reflected in the budget.
They will be reflected in the budget, Councilmember. They have not been as of the budget you see today. So we just presented the board last night with the issues that we were presented with School 25 and the boiler leaks. We actually had 3 separate boiler leaks. which have caused significant damage. So students will not be returning to school 25 in the immediate future. We will be examining 25 as we look into the 2021 school year, and we are projecting that we would have to move the school, but close the building. And if we in fact do that, the savings is estimated to be about $250,000 per year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Ortiz, and then Councilmember Gruber.
Yes, thank you. So my first question here is regarding the 4.5 million that you had in the beginning of the presentation that said that it was an estimated amount for an increase that you had hoped. I guess I'm just trying to get clarification for that, because are you still estimating that figure to come through, or because I don't see it as part of the additional $26 million roll up of additional cuts that you had to reflect there. Can you tell me more about the 4.5 that you put it in the budget as additional dollars, but it sounds like that's probably not going to come to fruition. So again, maybe I don't know, but can you tell us more about that? And are you going to be removing that and adding it to the 26?
It is part of the 26 already, council member, and that is part of the 26.6 additional deficit that we faced. If you go, Bob, do you know the slide number?
I'm looking at number 19 on here. That it looks like that's where the 26 is rolling up. So it says 17.5. It is in the 17?
It's part of the $17.5 million figure, yes.
Okay, all right. So thank you. That was my first one. I understand that we are not necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty of these details, but I do want to understand a little bit more about the reduction that you have listed here. And I understand your methodical calculations and formulas for counselors to students on here, but you made a reference here of a certain number of counselors that would be made available by the county as a support. Is that a contract, or is that an agreement that you've already made with the county to assist with those folks? And are those folks a direct connection to the services that we would be losing based on those that you would have reduced in this budget?
No, there is ongoing conversations, and they would not be replacing formal school counselors, but they would be supporting initiatives like restorative practices in our buildings and other services that they could offer to our families and supports to our families. We are still maintaining, they are not part of the 1 to 250 counseling ratio that you see, nor would they be part of the 1 to 25 social worker ratio. The slide is not up right now that we're identified in those slides. It would be in addition to.
Okay, so, and I understand that. I guess when we get additional information as you work through these next 2 weeks, I would like to be able to see more information on that, because even though they're in addition to, and yeah, I hear what you're saying in terms of the type of things that they would be supportive of, but are in fact those counselors, because I'm trying to think of where are there 32 counselors or what have you from the county that would be appropriate for this type of work that you're suggesting. So in the next few weeks, I'm interested in who those folks are, what agreement we may have in place to provide the services that you're talking about, and are they actually a good substitute for what it is you're hoping that they would do for us. So that's a question that I have. The other question that I have is, all of this is reductions, and I get that, but there was also information, or I guess, I don't know if it's official or not, but that there were additions as well that would be made. You made reference to the reduction of the one position for African American Studies, but that it would be replaced by a different position. I'd also like to better understand what additional positions you are putting into place on here, because obviously this is all reductions, but there's discussion of additional positions that are being added to central office, and I'd like to better understand those as well.
But I would just point out that the numbers that we showed you for overall reductions is the net number. So it's additions and reductions both. So there are no additional positions beyond what you see in the budget now. Our actual budget documents outline position by position where the reductions are and the additions are. I can tell you that under my particular section of the budget, there's a net impact of, I believe, 31.6 FTEs overall, and most of those are what I would consider central office reductions, administrative reductions here. Okay. helps.
Okay.
All right, thanks. I just want to make sure, BJ, you captured Jackie's one comment regarding the counselor part. We can make sure that that's, because I know that's more of an ongoing question that she wanted. I just want to make sure that was captured. And
Right.
then,
And I have one additional one that you can capture that can't be answered today, but it was made reference to that a lot of these services, bilingual services and what have you, that would be transitioning away from the academies and RIA and so on and so forth. And you made mention of it several times that all of the support and the needs of these students will be met. Obviously, it's not outlined here. I want to ensure, I would like to see that in writing, how exactly we are going to be servicing the needs of these students. As you said it several times, but I haven't seen a plan yet of how exactly we will do that.
We will provide it.
all right, thank you. Councilmember Gruber?
Yes,
question?
thank you. Thank you. Just, I think two fairly quick questions. So on page 18, the initial deficit reduction strategy, the single biggest cut is special education staff at $7 million. And I understood earlier in the presentation, there was talk about the ratios, and understood that a lot of the ratios that that you all were talking about were specifically ratios within the collective bargaining units. But I'm wondering, it seems to me, I know you provided some stats about how special ed staffing has gone up dramatically over the years, and I appreciate that information. But it seems to me like every time the district is hit as being out of compliance, it's in part with special education. So I'm not doubting that staffing has increased dramatically. What I'm questioning is, with this big $7 million cut in special ed, can we actually remain compliant with NICED? And I know I'm sure that I'm sure you all know this better than I, but I'd love to understand that in writing of what the compliance is in terms of the ratios, and if in fact with this cut we're able to meet it. And then my second question, just very briefly, is a few months ago there was a vote, an initiative by Superintendent Dade to take some of the pre-K slots from the CBOs and move them to 44 and 57. And there seemed to be a little bit of uncertainty around how that would actually benefit the budget. There was talk initially about how it would generate some savings, and then maybe it would be break even. I'm just wondering, now that you're in this point of the budget, if there's a clear sense of what moving the pre-K to 44 and 57 actually does for the district's budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Quick?
I would just briefly try and go back to the first question, if I may. So when I talk about the original ratios, those referred really our general education classrooms. Most of the $7 million in reductions you see under special education are far away from the actual classrooms. And so our ratios, whether it's a 12-1-1 or a 6-1-1 or an 8-1-1 or an 8-1-2, whatever the ratio is, they are all being maintained. You will see several administrative reductions in the special education programming. You will also see some areas like speech and some other areas where we've reduced some support areas where they're not in the classroom, they're away from the classroom. They're extra services and extra supports that will not impact the students on their daily basis. So I can assure you that we will meet all of the special education ratios, the NICED requirements, as you referred them to. It's not a collective bargaining issue, but it is actually a state ed mandate. And we have to continue to provide faith in all the services mandated by faith, and we will do so.
Chairperson Evans?
Yeah,
Mr. Evans?
President White.
Yes, real briefly, because
Yes.
I know that you had indicated this was not a meeting to discuss programmatic issues, but I do want to emphasize, first of all, we appreciate the probative nature of the questions on the program side. Council Member Gruber's question is one that the board has been really interested in, and I would repeat to all of the colleagues there at City Hall that the board is asking those same questions. Fortunately, we have a great team on the administrative side that can support us in providing those kinds of answers to those kind of concerns. So I just want to reassure our colleagues there at 131 West Broad Street that we are looking at the programmatic side, and the budget is not finished. And again, we're very blessed and fortunate to have a good financial team, good educators over there that will help us have the answers so that the budget that you see now, the proposed budget you see now, as obvious as you know, Council Member Evans, might look a bit different when it gets to you all, because we've had those questions answered and maybe made some appropriate programmatic changes. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Any other council members council members have questions on any of this stuff? And again, when we end here today, the conversation is not ending because we have the opportunity to continue. BJ has come up with a great way to start conversations through questions back and forth now as we lead up to the budget being submitted. So I hope that this is helpful and constructive for everyone in terms of seeing thoughts that council members are thinking about, but also hearing where you guys are at in the process. Because we do know that you're going through your budget process, but it is a process that the sooner we start having conversations earlier, I think it will be much smoother during the June budget confirmation hearing, which takes place on June the 10th. So this gives us a good head start. Any other questions or comments from any of my colleagues? Great. So our next steps will be staff will reach out to see when we want to connect again. I hope that soon we'll be able to connect in person. I think that it's much better to be able to see each other face to face and talk across the table. But I thank you all for your patience in doing this remotely as we deal with the COVID-19 situation. But obviously, I hope to have at least one more conversation before you guys send your budget over to City Hall. I believe, am I correct, Mr. Franklin, and President White, that your vote is on May 5th for your budget?
It'll be May 7th.
May 7th. So even after that, after you send that over, I think the next conversations that we have in May will be even more instructive because you'll have that final budget. So we might be able to dig deeper into some of the other questions that are outstanding. I want to wish you guys luck as you go through this budget. I would just remind everyone that the city, we also have a very challenging budget that we are also dealing with. The Mayor Warren is going to release her budget on May 15th, and then we'll start our hearing on June 3rd. But prior to that, on April 30th, we'll have a CIP hearing related to our budget. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for their time today. And I look forward to continuing the conversation in a constructive way as we look at understanding that our finances are very much linked together. So a successful district budget helps all the residents of the city of Rochester. So I thank you all for coming today. And if there's not any other business to come before the Finance Committee, I will consider us adjourned. Thank you, everybody.